In the grand theater of human society, we are all actors playing roles dictated by invisible scripts written by others. These scripts, which we call social rules, govern everything from how we speak to how we think, from what we desire to what we fear. Most people follow these rules without question, believing them to be natural laws as immutable as gravity itself. But that keen observer of human nature and power dynamics understood something that escapes the masses. Many of these social rules are not divine commandments or natural laws, but rather tools of control wielded by those who benefit from keeping others in line. The Florentine political theorist who gave us The Prince was not merely concerned with the mechanics of political power, though that is how history remembers him. He was fundamentally interested in the nature of human behavior, the psychology of influence, and the hidden mechanisms that determine who rises and who falls in the complex hierarchies of human society. His insights, controversial though they may be, reveal uncomfortable truths about the social contracts we unconsciously agree to every day. Consider the young professional who remains silent in meetings, following the unwritten rule that junior employees should speak only when spoken to. This person watches as less qualified but more assertive colleagues advance past them, wondering why merit alone seems insufficient for success. The answer lies not in their lack of ability, but in their adherence to a social rule designed to maintain existing power structures. The rule serves those already in positions of authority by ensuring that potential challengers remain docile and invisible. Or observe the entrepreneur who refuses to discuss money openly, following the social convention that financial ambition is somehow vulgar or unseemly. This person struggles to raise capital, negotiate fair deals, or build wealth, all while competing against others who have quietly abandoned this particular social nicety. The taboo around money talk serves to keep financial literacy and opportunity concentrated among those already comfortable discussing such matters, typically those who were raised in environments where financial success was normalized rather than stigmatized. These examples illustrate what understood centuries ago. Social rules often function as invisible chains, and those who learn to selectively ignore the most limiting ones gain significant advantages over those who follow them blindly. This is not to advocate for the abandonment of all social norms. Society requires certain shared agreements to function. Rather, it is to suggest that intelligent individuals must learn to distinguish between rules that serve collective good and rules that merely serve existing power structures. The key insight is that social rules are not neutral. They are created, maintained, and enforced by particular groups for particular purposes. Some rules genuinely benefit everyone, those against violence, theft, or deception in most contexts. But many others primarily benefit those who are already successful, wealthy, or powerful, often at the expense of those seeking to improve their circumstances. Learning to identify which rules fall into which category becomes a crucial skill for anyone seeking to advance in life, rather than merely survive within existing systems. This document explores this theme through 3 interconnected narratives, each illuminating different aspects of how social rules function as instruments of control, and how strategic noncompliance can lead to extraordinary outcomes. The first part examines professional and economic rules that keep ambitious individuals trapped in cycles of mediocrity. The second delves into social and cultural rules that prevent authentic self-expression and genuine relationship building. The third investigates political and ideological rules that constrain independent thinking and moral reasoning. Part I, the economic prison of false virtues. Marco had always been the model employee. For 12 years at the consulting firm, he arrived early, stayed late, never questioned assignments, and maintained the pleasant demeanor expected of someone in his position. He followed every unwritten rule. Don't discuss salary with colleagues, don't seem too eager for promotion, always defer to senior partners in meetings, and never appear to prioritize money over company loyalty. These weren't rules written in any employee handbook, but they were as real and binding as any formal policy. Everyone understood them, and everyone followed them. The partners praised Marco's professionalism and dedication. They gave him excellent performance reviews and trusted him with important clients. What they didn't give him was meaningful advancement or compensation that reflected his actual value to the firm. Year after year, he watched newer employees, often less skilled but more politically savvy, leapfrog past him into senior positions. The pattern was consistent. Those who succeeded were those who had learned to quietly ignore certain social rules while maintaining the appearance of compliance. The breakthrough came during a conversation with a former colleague who had left to start her own consulting practice. Over coffee, she shared something that changed Marco's entire perspective on professional success. She had been tracking the careers of their former colleagues and noticed a striking pattern. The most successful ones had systematically violated specific social rules, but they had done so strategically and often invisibly. "Remember David?" asked, referring to a colleague who had become a partner in record time. "He was always talking about money, not crudely, but constantly. He'd mention client billing rates, discuss market rates for different services, talk about the financial impact of various business decisions. Management thought he was exceptionally business-minded. What he was really doing was breaking the taboo against money talk that kept the rest of us ignorant about the financial realities of our work." This observation forced Marco to reconsider everything he thought he knew about professional advancement. The social rule against discussing money wasn't protecting anyone's dignity or maintaining workplace harmony. It was protecting the firm's ability to underpay talented people who remained ignorant of their market value. By following this rule religiously, Marco had essentially agreed to his own economic exploitation. Continued sharing her insights, each one more revelatory than the last. "Remember how we were all taught never to seem too ambitious, to wait for opportunities to be offered rather than pursuing them aggressively. That rule doesn't exist to maintain some kind of professional grace. It exists to keep talented people passive while more aggressive competitors seize opportunities." The pattern became clear as described how their most successful former colleagues had operated. They had learned to appear collaborative while ruthlessly pursuing their own interests. They had mastered the art of seeming humble while consistently promoting their own achievements. They had discovered how to build genuine relationships while simultaneously using those relationships for professional advantage. Most importantly, they had abandoned the notion that merit alone would be recognized and rewarded. This last point struck Marco as particularly significant. He had been raised to believe that hard work and competence would naturally lead to success, a belief that now seemed not just naive, but actively counterproductive. This belief system served the interests of employers who benefited from having dedicated workers who didn't aggressively negotiate for better terms. It was a social rule disguised as a moral principle, and following it had cost Marco years of career stagnation. The conversation sparked a period of intense self-reflection for Marco. He began observing his workplace with new eyes, paying attention to the unspoken rules that governed behavior and analyzing who benefited from each one. The rule against self-promotion, for instance, didn't prevent egotism or maintain workplace harmony. It simply ensured that only those comfortable violating this rule would have their achievements recognized. The modest employees remained invisible, their contributions taken for granted. Similarly, the expectation that employees should be grateful for their positions and loyal to the company served to suppress salary negotiations and prevent people from exploring better opportunities. This wasn't about maintaining a positive workplace culture. It was about maintaining a captive workforce. Companies benefited enormously from employees who felt guilty about pursuing their own financial interests or seeking better positions elsewhere. Marco's awakening extended beyond workplace dynamics to broader economic realities. He realized that many of the social rules governing financial behavior served to keep wealth concentrated among those already possessing it. The stigma against discussing money meant that financial literacy remained low among the working and middle classes. The social pressure to be modest about financial ambitions meant that many talented people never learned to negotiate effectively or pursue high-value opportunities. Even the cultural emphasis on being a team player served specific economic interests. While cooperation and collaboration genuinely benefit organizations in many ways, the social pressure to always put team interests first often prevented individuals from advocating for themselves. It created a dynamic where the most assertive and self-interested people advanced, while those who genuinely prioritized collective success remained in supporting roles. Armed with these insights, Marco began experimenting with selective rule-breaking. He started discussing market rates and industry salary ranges with colleagues, framing these conversations as market research rather than personal grievances. He began documenting and promoting his achievements, not through boastful announcements, but through strategic communication that ensured his contributions were visible to decision-makers. He started networking aggressively, building relationships not just within his company but throughout the industry. The changes in his career trajectory were dramatic. Within 18 months, Marco had received 2 significant promotions and a salary increase that doubled his income. More importantly, he had developed a completely different relationship with his professional life. Instead of waiting for recognition and advancement to be bestowed upon him, he had learned to actively shape his own career path. But Marco's transformation went beyond personal career advancement. He began to see how these same dynamics played out in broader economic contexts. Entrepreneurs who succeeded were often those who ignored social rules about modesty, patience, and deference to established authorities. They promoted themselves aggressively, pursued opportunities without waiting for permission, and prioritized their own financial interests while maintaining the appearance of serving others. The most successful investors were those who ignored social pressures to follow conventional wisdom, instead developing the intellectual independence to make contrarian decisions. They understood that popular investment advice was often designed to benefit financial institutions rather than individual investors. By learning to think independently about financial markets, they were able to build wealth while others followed crowdsourced strategies that generated mediocre returns. Even in everyday financial decisions, those who prospered were often those who had abandoned limiting social rules. They negotiated aggressively for better prices, pursued the highest returns on their money rather than settling for convenient options, and prioritized their own financial security over social expectations about generosity and spending. This pattern extended to entrepreneurship, where the most successful business builders were those who had learned to ignore social rules about fairness, equality, and shared sacrifice. They paid themselves well even when their businesses were struggling, recognizing that their own financial stability was crucial to the company's long-term success. They made difficult decisions about hiring and firing based on business needs rather than social obligations. They priced their products and services to maximize profit rather than to seem accessible or fair to customers who couldn't afford premium pricing. None of this meant becoming selfish, dishonest, or harmful to others. Rather, it meant recognizing that many social rules about economic behavior were designed to benefit existing power structures rather than individuals seeking to improve their circumstances. Those who learned to distinguish between genuinely ethical principles and disguised control mechanisms gained enormous advantages in building wealth and advancing their careers. The psychological transformation required for this shift cannot be understated. Most people are deeply conditioned to follow social rules without question, experiencing guilt and anxiety when they consider violating even the most arbitrary conventions. Overcoming this conditioning requires developing what Marco came to think of as selective rebelliousness, the ability to strategically ignore rules that serve others' interests while maintaining genuine ethical principles that serve broader social goods. This selective approach proved crucial. Marco discovered that abandoning all social rules would have been as counterproductive as following all of them. The key was learning to analyze each rule critically. Who benefits from this rule? What happens to people who follow it versus those who ignore it? Is this rule based on genuine ethical principles or merely social conventions designed to maintain existing hierarchies? Through this analysis, Marco developed a sophisticated understanding of how social rules function as tools of economic control. He learned to navigate professional and financial environments with strategic intelligence rather than naive compliance. Most importantly, he discovered that success in economic contexts often requires the courage to violate social expectations while maintaining the appearance of respectability. Part II, the social theater of manufactured consent. Sarah had spent her entire adult life trying to be liked. This wasn't unusual. Most people share this desire to some degree. But Sarah had elevated people-pleasing to an art form, carefully calibrating her opinions, interests, and even personality to match whatever she believed others wanted to see. She followed every social rule about politeness and avoiding conflict. She never expressed controversial opinions, never disagreed too forcefully with anyone, and always sought to find common ground even when fundamental differences existed. This approach had made her many acquaintances but few genuine friends. She was invited to social gatherings but rarely felt truly connected to anyone there. People described her as nice and sweet, but these superficial compliments masked a deeper truth. Nobody really knew who Sarah was, including Sarah herself. Years of following social rules designed to maintain harmony had left her with a carefully constructed persona that bore little resemblance to her authentic thoughts and feelings. The turning point came during a dinner party where the conversation turned to a controversial political topic. Sarah found herself automatically nodding and making agreeable comments, despite having strong personal opinions that contradicted what others were saying. She watched herself perform this social charade with growing discomfort, realizing that she had become a stranger to herself in pursuit of universal approval. That night, Sarah encountered a book that would reshape her understanding of social dynamics entirely. It was a biography of a successful artist who had built her career by deliberately violating social expectations about how women should behave in professional settings. The artist had been described as difficult, demanding, and uncompromising, characteristics that would typically be seen as social liabilities. Yet these same traits had enabled her to create groundbreaking work and build authentic relationships with people who respected her honesty and integrity. Reading this biography, Sarah began to understand something that had observed centuries earlier. Social rules about agreeableness and conflict avoidance often serve to suppress authentic expression and genuine relationship building. These rules don't create real harmony. They create a superficial peace that benefits those who prefer to avoid challenging conversations and maintain existing power dynamics. The social rule requiring constant agreeableness, Sarah realized, served multiple functions that had little to do with genuine kindness or social harmony. It prevented difficult but necessary conversations from taking place, allowing problems to persist unaddressed. It rewarded people who were comfortable with superficial relationships while penalizing those seeking deeper connections. Most significantly, it enabled manipulative individuals to operate without challenge, since disagreeing with them would violate social expectations about politeness. Sarah began experimenting with selective authenticity, starting with small violations of social expectations. Instead of automatically agreeing with opinions she found questionable, she began expressing thoughtful disagreement. Rather than pretending to enjoy social activities that bored her, she started politely declining invitations and suggesting alternatives that genuinely interested her. Instead of suppressing her own opinions to avoid potential conflict, she began sharing her actual thoughts while maintaining respect for others' right to disagree. The initial results were unsettling. Some people who had seemed to enjoy her company became distant when she stopped reflexively agreeing with everything they said. Certain social invitations stopped coming when she began declining events that didn't align with her interests. A few individuals who had grown accustomed to her constant accommodation became irritated when she started setting boundaries and expressing her own preferences. But something remarkable happened alongside these losses. Sarah began attracting different types of relationships. People who valued authenticity and intellectual honesty started gravitating toward her. Conversations became more engaging because they involved real exchange of ideas rather than polite agreement. She discovered that many people actually preferred honest disagreement to false harmony, and that conflict, when handled respectfully, often strengthened relationships rather than destroying them. This transformation forced Sarah to confront another social rule she had followed unconsciously: the belief that her value as a person depended on others' approval. This rule, perhaps more than any other, had shaped her entire approach to social interaction. She had operated under the assumption that being disliked or disapproved of would somehow diminish her worth as a human being. This assumption had made her dependent on external validation, constantly adjusting her behavior based on others' reactions rather than developing internal standards for her own conduct. Would have recognized this dynamic immediately. The need for universal approval is perhaps the most effective tool for controlling human behavior, because it makes people voluntarily surrender their autonomy in exchange for social acceptance. Those who can learn to tolerate disapproval, not by becoming callous or cruel, but by developing internal validation, gain enormous freedom to pursue their genuine interests and express their authentic selves. Sarah's journey toward selective authenticity revealed how many social rules function as control mechanisms rather than genuine guides for ethical behavior. The expectation that women should always be pleasant and accommodating, for instance, wasn't designed to make society more harmonious. It was designed to prevent women from asserting themselves in ways that might challenge existing power structures. Men who violated similar rules, who were direct, assertive, or uncompromising, were often described as leaders, while women displaying identical behaviors were labeled as difficult or aggressive. Similarly, the social pressure to avoid controversial topics wasn't really about maintaining peace. It was about preventing conversations that might challenge prevailing beliefs or power structures. Those who benefited from existing arrangements naturally preferred that others avoid raising uncomfortable questions or alternative perspectives. The rule against controversial conversation served to maintain intellectual conformity while appearing to promote social harmony. Sarah began to see how these dynamics played out in her professional life as well. The expectation that she should always be collaborative and consensus-seeking had prevented her from advocating strongly for her own ideas or challenging inferior proposals from colleagues. While collaboration genuinely benefits many projects, the social pressure to always seek agreement often resulted in mediocre outcomes that satisfied no one while offending no one. Those who learned to selectively violate these expectations, who could be diplomatically assertive when necessary, often achieved better results while maintaining necessary working relationships. The transformation in Sarah's social life was profound. By learning to express disagreement respectfully, she found that her relationships became more honest and therefore more satisfying. By setting boundaries around her time and energy, she discovered that people actually respected her more rather than less. By sharing her genuine interests and opinions, she attracted friends who appreciated her for who she actually was rather than for her ability to be endlessly accommodating. But perhaps the most significant change was in Sarah's relationship with herself. For the first time in years, she felt like she was living according to her own values rather than constantly adapting to others' expectations. This alignment between her internal beliefs and external behavior created a sense of integrity and self-respect that had been missing from her life for decades. The process wasn't without challenges. Learning to tolerate others' disapproval required developing emotional resilience and internal validation systems. Some people who had been accustomed to her constant accommodation never adjusted to her more authentic approach, and those relationships ended. There were moments when the social pressure to return to people-pleasing behavior felt overwhelming, particularly in professional settings where conformity was expected. However, Sarah discovered that the benefits of selective authenticity far outweighed these temporary discomforts. Her work became more fulfilling because she was contributing her genuine perspective rather than simply echoing others' ideas. Her friendships became more meaningful because they were based on actual compatibility rather than superficial pleasantness. Her romantic relationships improved dramatically because potential partners were meeting her authentic self rather than a carefully constructed persona designed to be universally appealing. Most importantly, Sarah developed what she came to think of as social courage. The ability to violate social expectations when doing so served her genuine interests or principles. This didn't mean becoming selfish or inconsiderate. Rather, it meant learning to distinguish between social rules that genuinely promoted mutual benefit and those that simply maintained existing power dynamics or prevented authentic human connection. This distinction proved crucial as Sarah navigated increasingly complex social situations. She learned to honor genuine ethical principles while ignoring arbitrary social conventions. She developed the ability to be kind without being accommodating, honest without being cruel, and assertive without being aggressive. These nuanced social skills enabled her to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided accommodation. The broader implications of Sarah's transformation extended beyond her personal relationships. She began to see how social rules about agreeableness and conflict avoidance functioned in larger social and political contexts. The pressure to maintain civility often prevented necessary conversations about systemic problems. The expectation that people should always seek common ground enabled those with extreme positions to shift discourse in their direction, while moderates continuously compromised their own principles in pursuit of false harmony. Understanding these dynamics gave Sarah a more sophisticated perspective on social and political issues. She learned to distinguish between genuine dialogue aimed at mutual understanding and manipulative communication designed to control others' behavior. She developed the ability to engage with difficult topics while maintaining respect for others' dignity, even when disagreeing strongly with their positions. This social intelligence proved invaluable in professional settings, where Sarah learned to navigate office politics with strategic awareness rather than naive compliance. She understood how social rules about hierarchy, deference, and team harmony often serve to maintain existing power structures rather than promote genuine collaboration. By selectively violating these rules while maintaining professional competence and basic courtesy, she was able to advance her career while preserving her integrity. The journey from people-pleasing to selective authenticity represented more than personal growth for Sarah. It represented a fundamental shift in how she understood the relationship between individual autonomy and social harmony. She discovered that genuine social harmony often requires individuals to express their authentic selves, including their disagreements and boundaries, rather than pretending to constant agreement. Paradoxically, by becoming less universally agreeable, she became more genuinely to people who valued authenticity and integrity. Part III, the political machinery of manufactured morality. Dr. James Morton had built his academic career on careful intellectual conformity. As a professor of political science at a prestigious university, he understood implicitly which ideas were acceptable to express, which research questions were safe to pursue, and which conclusions were expected from any serious scholar. These weren't formal rules written in any faculty handbook, but they were as binding as any official policy. Everyone in academic circles understood them, and those who violated them found their careers quietly but effectively terminated. For 15 years, James had navigated this environment successfully, publishing papers that reinforced acceptable viewpoints, teaching courses that covered approved perspectives, and participating in conferences where intellectual diversity was celebrated in theory but discouraged in practice. He had tenure, respect from colleagues, and a comfortable position in an institution that prided itself on intellectual freedom and rigorous inquiry. What he didn't have was any real sense that he was contributing to genuine understanding of complex social and political issues. The awakening began when James encountered a research finding that contradicted everything he had been taught about a particular social policy. The data was clear, the methodology was sound, and the implications were significant. But the conclusion violated fundamental assumptions held by virtually everyone in his field. Publishing this research would require challenging not just specific policies, but the entire ideological framework that justified those policies. James faced a choice that revealed the true nature of academic and intellectual discourse. He could suppress or reframe his findings to align with acceptable conclusions, maintaining his career and social standing while contributing to what he now recognized as intellectual dishonesty. Or he could publish the research honestly, knowing that doing so would likely damage his reputation, limit his career prospects, and potentially ostracize him from the academic community he had spent decades joining. This dilemma forced James to confront something that had understood centuries ago. Many social rules about intellectual and moral discourse serve to prevent genuine inquiry rather than promote it. The academic emphasis on consensus and peer approval often functioned to suppress inconvenient findings and maintain ideological conformity. The social pressure to avoid controversial conclusions served those who benefited from existing policies and beliefs, regardless of their actual effectiveness or truth value. James began to examine the intellectual environment around him with new eyes, paying attention to which ideas were encouraged and which were subtly discouraged. He noticed that research questions themselves were constrained by unstated assumptions about what conclusions would be acceptable. Studies that might challenge prevailing orthodoxies were simply not undertaken, not because they lacked merit, but because everyone understood that certain findings would be unwelcome. The peer review process, supposedly designed to ensure intellectual rigor, often functioned more as a mechanism for ideological enforcement. Papers that confirmed existing beliefs sailed through review with minor modifications, while those that challenged fundamental assumptions faced extraordinary scrutiny and often insurmountable objections. The system wasn't designed to identify truth. It was designed to maintain consensus among a particular group of intellectuals who had significant investments in certain conclusions. James realized that what he had mistaken for intellectual sophistication was often merely elaborate rationalization of predetermined beliefs. The complex theories and nuanced arguments that filled academic journals frequently served to justify positions that had been adopted for non-intellectual reasons: career advancement, social acceptance, political affiliation, or simple conformity to peer group expectations. The appearance of rigorous analysis concealed what was essentially ideological advocacy. This recognition extended beyond academia to broader social and political discourse. James began to see how social rules about acceptable opinions served to limit the range of debate while maintaining the appearance of open discussion. Controversial ideas weren't explicitly banned. They were simply made socially costly to express. This created a dynamic where only those willing to pay significant social and professional prices could introduce genuinely challenging perspectives. The mechanism was elegant in its subtlety. Rather than obvious censorship, which would generate resistance and opposition, the system relied on social pressure and career incentives to maintain intellectual conformity. Most people voluntarily suppressed inconvenient thoughts and questions, not because they were forced to, but because expressing them would violate social rules about appropriate discourse. The result was a form of soft totalitarianism that achieved thought control through social engineering rather than direct coercion. James decided to publish his controversial research, understanding that doing so would violate several unwritten rules about academic conduct. He prepared for the inevitable backlash, but what surprised him was the nature of the response. Rather than engaging with his findings intellectually, critics focused on his motivations, his methodology, and his character. The substance of his research was largely ignored in favor of personal attacks and attempts to discredit him professionally. This response revealed another crucial insight about how social rules function in intellectual discourse. When genuine debate might lead to uncomfortable conclusions, the rules shift to prevent such debate from occurring. Instead of addressing ideas on their merits, the system encourages ad attacks, guilt by association, and questioning of motives. These tactics serve to discourage others from pursuing similar research while maintaining the appearance of intellectual engagement. The personal costs of James's intellectual honesty were significant. Several long-term friendships ended when colleagues distanced themselves from someone who had violated social expectations about appropriate research. Conference invitations dried up as organizers sought to avoid the controversy his presence might generate. Grant applications faced unusual scrutiny and were often rejected for reasons that seemed unrelated to their intellectual merit. But something remarkable happened alongside these losses. James began connecting with scholars and intellectuals outside the mainstream academic bubble, many of whom had similar experiences with suppressed research and discouraged inquiry. He discovered a thriving network of independent thinkers who had learned to operate outside traditional institutional constraints while maintaining rigorous intellectual standards. These connections led James to understand that intellectual conformity wasn't limited to academia. Similar dynamics operated throughout society, creating what amounted to manufactured consensus on complex issues. Social rules about appropriate opinion functioned to prevent genuine debate on important questions, ensuring that only a narrow range of perspectives received serious consideration in public discourse. The mechanisms varied across different institutions and social contexts, but the underlying pattern remained consistent. In media organizations, social rules about objectivity and balance often resulted in coverage that avoided challenging powerful interests while maintaining the appearance of independent journalism. In corporate environments, rules about team loyalty and positive thinking prevented honest assessment of business strategies and leadership decisions. In religious and ideological communities, rules about faith and commitment discouraged questions that might undermine group cohesion and shared beliefs. James began to see how these various control mechanisms worked together to create what amounted to a comprehensive system for managing public opinion and social behavior. The rules weren't centrally coordinated, but they served similar functions, preventing inconvenient questions from being asked, discouraging uncomfortable answers from being shared, and maintaining social and political arrangements that benefited existing power structures. The most insidious aspect of this system was how it recruited its own enforcers. Most people genuinely believed they were upholding important moral and intellectual principles when they punished rule violators. They saw themselves as protecting society from dangerous ideas rather than as agents of intellectual oppression. This sincere conviction made the system remarkably stable, since even those harmed by it often defended the very rules that limited their own intellectual freedom. Understanding these dynamics gave James a completely different perspective on social and political issues. He learned to distinguish between genuine moral principles and manufactured moral obligations designed to serve particular interests. He developed the ability to analyze social rules critically, asking who benefited from each rule and what happened to people who followed versus ignored them. This analytical approach proved especially valuable when applied to contemporary political discourse. James noticed how social rules about appropriate language and acceptable opinion often served to prevent discussion of important issues rather than promote genuine understanding. The emphasis on avoiding offensive or controversial statements frequently resulted in superficial conversations that skirted around fundamental disagreements while pretending to meaningful dialogue. Similarly, rules about ideological purity within political movements often prevented the kind of intellectual diversity that might lead to more effective strategies and policies. Those who questioned orthodox positions within their own political tribes faced social sanctions that encouraged conformity over critical thinking. The result was political movements that became increasingly divorced from reality as they lost the capacity for self-correction through internal debate. James's transformation from conformist academic to independent intellectual required developing what he came to think of as intellectual courage, the ability to pursue truth regardless of social and professional consequences. This didn't mean becoming a contrarian or rejecting all conventional wisdom. Rather, it meant learning to evaluate ideas based on evidence and logic rather than social acceptability. The development of this intellectual independence proved liberating in ways James hadn't anticipated. His research became more innovative and impactful because he was free to pursue questions that others avoided. His teaching became more engaging because he could present multiple perspectives on controversial issues rather than promoting single orthodoxies. His writing became more honest and therefore more compelling because he was expressing genuine conclusions rather than socially expected positions. Most importantly, James developed a more sophisticated understanding of how ideas function in society. He learned to distinguish between beliefs that were held because they were true and beliefs that were held because they were useful for particular social or political purposes. This distinction proved crucial for navigating a world where intellectual and moral positions often served multiple functions beyond their ostensible purposes. The broader implications of James's intellectual journey extended far beyond academia. He began to see how similar patterns of manufactured consensus operated in various social institutions, from religious organizations to political movements to professional associations. Each context had its own rules about acceptable thought and appropriate expression, but the underlying mechanisms remained remarkably consistent across different environments. This understanding gave James tools for analyzing social and political issues that went far beyond traditional academic approaches. Instead of simply accepting prevailing wisdom or joining partisan debates, he learned to identify the interests served by different intellectual positions and the rules that maintained various forms of consensus. This analytical framework proved invaluable for understanding complex social phenomena and developing more effective strategies for social change. Perhaps most significantly, James discovered that intellectual independence often required violating social rules about appropriate humility and deference to authority. The expectation that individuals should defer to expert opinion and institutional wisdom served to prevent independent thinking while maintaining existing power structures. Those who learned to think for themselves, while remaining open to evidence and argument, often developed insights unavailable to those constrained by social expectations about intellectual conformity. The journey from intellectual conformity to genuine independence represented more than personal growth for James. It represented a fundamental shift in how he understood the relationship between individual conscience and social obligation. He discovered that genuine social progress often required individuals to violate social rules about appropriate thought and expression, even when doing so carried significant personal costs. Paradoxically, by becoming less socially acceptable in conventional terms, he became more intellectually honest and therefore more capable of contributing to genuine understanding and positive social change. The three narratives woven throughout this document illustrate a fundamental truth that understood, but that modern society often obscures. Many social rules function as instruments of control rather than genuine guides for ethical behavior. Marco's journey through the economic landscape, Sarah's transformation in social relationships, and James's awakening in intellectual discourse all demonstrate how selectively ignoring certain social rules can lead to greater authenticity, effectiveness, and ultimately, genuine service to others. The key insight running through all three stories is that social rules are not neutral or natural phenomena. They are created, maintained, and enforced by particular groups for particular purposes. Some rules genuinely serve collective interests and should be respected and upheld, but many others primarily serve existing power structures, often at the expense of individual autonomy, authentic relationship building, and genuine progress toward truth and justice. Learning to distinguish between these different types of rules becomes a crucial skill for anyone seeking to live an authentic and effective life. This requires developing what might be called strategic social intelligence, the ability to analyze social rules critically while maintaining genuine ethical principles and respect for others' legitimate interests. The Machiavellian perspective offers valuable tools for this analysis, not because it advocates for selfishness or amorality, but because it recognizes that human social systems are complex power structures that often operate differently than their stated purposes suggest. Those who learn to see these systems clearly, rather than accepting them at face value, gain the ability to navigate them more effectively while preserving their integrity and autonomy. The stories of Marco, Sarah, and James also illustrate that violating social rules is not without costs. Each character faced significant social and professional consequences for their choices to ignore certain expectations and conventions. But in each case, these short-term costs led to long-term benefits that far exceeded what they could have achieved through continued conformity. This pattern suggests an important principle. The social rules that are most difficult to violate are often the ones most worth examining critically. The intense social pressure to conform to particular expectations frequently indicates that those expectations serve someone's interests, interests that may not align with your own well-being or authentic values. Perhaps most importantly, the document demonstrates that selective rule-breaking can be an ethical choice rather than a selfish one. Marco's economic independence enabled him to be more generous and helpful to others. Sarah's authentic self-expression led to more honest and meaningful relationships. James's intellectual courage contributed to genuine understanding rather than manufactured consensus. In each case, violating certain social rules enabled these individuals to serve genuine moral principles more effectively than blind conformity ever could have. The Machiavellian insight is not that morality is irrelevant, but that apparent morality and genuine morality are often quite different things. Social rules that masquerade as moral principles frequently serve to prevent individuals from living according to their authentic values and contributing their genuine gifts to the world. Learning to distinguish between true ethical obligations and disguised control mechanisms becomes essential for anyone seeking to live with integrity and effectiveness. The implications of this perspective extend far beyond individual success to broader social and political questions. If many social rules function as control mechanisms rather than genuine guides for ethical behavior, then social progress may often require violations of existing expectations and conventions. Those who are willing to pay the social costs of challenging limiting rules may be performing a crucial service for society, even when their actions appear selfish or disruptive from conventional perspectives. This doesn't mean that all rule-breaking is virtuous or that social conventions serve no legitimate purpose. Rather, it suggests that intelligent social participation requires the ability to analyze rules critically and make conscious choices about which ones to follow and which ones to ignore. This analytical approach, combined with genuine ethical principles and respect for others' legitimate interests, offers a path toward authentic living that serves both individual flourishing and genuine social progress. The deadly social rules explored in this document, economic deference, social people-pleasing, and intellectual conformity, represent just a few examples of how social expectations can limit human potential. Each individual must identify which rules in their own context serve limiting rather than liberating functions. The key is developing the analytical tools and moral courage necessary to make these distinctions consciously rather than following social programming unconsciously. Ultimately, the Machiavellian perspective on social rules offers not a blueprint for selfishness, but a framework for authentic autonomy in service of genuine values. Those who learn to think strategically about social expectations while maintaining their ethical principles often discover that they can serve others more effectively than those who follow all social rules without question. In a world where apparent virtue and genuine virtue are often quite different things, the courage to violate limiting social rules may be one of the most important gifts an individual can offer to society.